Racist cop shoves black woman not knowing she authored the sanctions that'll erase his entire record. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to our main character. Jessica Turner was a woman who didn't need to prove herself to anyone. She had earned her place in the world, not by shouting about it, but by quietly moving through life with an air of quiet authority. At first glance, no one would know that Jessica was more than just a woman walking through a park on a peaceful afternoon. She looked like anyone else, her posture calm, her stride deliberate, and her expression unreadable. But there was so much more beneath the surface. Jessica had spent years working in the shadows, crafting policies and decisions that would one day change the course of history. What the people around her didn't know was that she was the architect of the very sanctions that would eventually bring justice to many who had been wronged. As she walked through the park, lost in her thoughts, she felt a sudden shove from behind. It was a hard push, and it jolted her forward. She spun around quickly, startled, only to find a man in a police uniform standing there. Officer Ryan Foster, a man who prided himself on his sense of justice, had just crossed the line. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" he snapped, his eyes narrowing as he looked at her. "You can't just walk around here like you own the place." Jessica's heart rate didn't increase. She didn't flinch. She simply stood there, letting the words roll off her like water off a duck's back. She had dealt with worse, much worse in her career. Foster didn't know it yet, but Jessica was the one person who could erase his entire career with a single phone call. She was the one who had written the very regulations that would bring him to his knees. But for now, she didn't show any of that. She just looked at him, her eyes calm, steady, and silent. The crowd that had gathered began to murmur, their whispers rippling through the air. Some were curious, some were uncomfortable, but all of them were watching. Jessica's calmness only seemed to agitate Foster more. He had expected her to fight back, to show some sign of fear or anger, but she didn't. "I said move it," he barked again, this time pushing her harder, but Jessica didn't budge. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Her silence was the weapon she wielded most effectively. As the crowd continued to watch, Jessica realized that today was not just another ordinary day in the park. This was the moment that would change everything. Little did Officer Foster know, his life was about to be turned upside down. It would all start with a woman who had authored the very regulations that would erase his entire record. Jessica stood in the park, unmoved by Officer Ryan Foster's harsh words. The crowd around them began to murmur, their eyes flickering between the two, unsure of what would happen next. Foster had expected the usual reaction, fear, resistance, something that would allow him to exert his authority. But Jessica's silence threw him off. She wasn't just another woman he could intimidate. She was something far more dangerous, though he didn't know it yet. His brow furrowed in frustration. "Are you going to stand there?" he demanded, his voice rising slightly. Jessica continued to remain calm, her gaze unblinking as she looked at him. "I said move." He took a step forward, leaning into her space, but Jessica held her ground. She knew exactly how to handle men like him, who thought they could control others with nothing more than their presence. Officer Foster's hands balled into fists, his face reddening as his patience wore thin. It was almost as if he thought pushing a woman around would give him the satisfaction he was seeking. But Jessica wasn't interested in giving him that satisfaction. She had seen far worse in her line of work, and she had learned long ago that the best way to deal with bullies like Foster was to remain composed, to let them reveal themselves for who they truly were. A few moments passed in uncomfortable silence, but the tension was palpable. The crowd around them had quieted, waiting for something to break the stillness. Jessica's mind was focused, already running through the possibilities of how she would handle this situation. She had been prepared for something like this for years. The truth was, Foster had no idea who he was dealing with. Jessica Turner wasn't just any woman. She wasn't just another person caught in a random encounter with the law. She had the power to erase the very existence of men like him from the system he had so blindly trusted. And soon, she would prove it. "This is your last chance," Foster sneered, stepping closer, his voice low and threatening. But Jessica remained unwavering, her calmness a shield that had withstood far worse than a police officer's empty threats. She took a step back, reached into her bag, and pulled out a small card. "I don't think you understand," she said, her voice steady but filled with quiet authority. Foster blinked, taken aback by her composure. The crowd seemed to lean in, sensing something was about to happen. "I've been watching your actions closely, officer," Jessica continued. "And what you don't realize is that I've already written the sanctions that will erase your entire record from existence. All it takes is a single phone call." The words hit Foster like a punch to the gut, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. His jaw tightened as he struggled to process what she had just said. Jessica could see the wheels turning in his mind, the realization dawning on him too late. He had underestimated her, and now it was too late to take it back. The crowd was silent, but the tension was electric. Jessica stood there, her posture poised, knowing that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. Officer Foster had no idea what he had just walked into. He had thought he could push around anyone he wanted, but Jessica was no ordinary woman. She was the one who would make sure his abuse of power was stopped, and she had the power to do it. Jessica could feel the shift in the atmosphere around her, the energy of the crowd thickening as she spoke those words. Officer Ryan Foster stood frozen, his expression a mixture of disbelief and confusion. The fact that Jessica had revealed such a powerful truth shook him to his core. He had always been in control, always able to push people around and get away with it, but now he was facing someone who had power he couldn't even begin to comprehend. His hands, which had been clenched in frustration just moments ago, slowly relaxed as doubt crept into his mind. For a moment, he couldn't find his voice. "What are you talking about?" He finally managed, his tone unsteady. Jessica didn't move, didn't flinch. She simply held his gaze, her eyes steady and unyielding. "I'm talking about the fact that your actions are being watched, Officer Foster," she said calmly. "And you won't be able to hide behind your badge any longer." The weight of her words landed heavily, not just on Foster, but on the crowd that had gathered. They had all seen the confrontation unfold, and now they could feel the shift in power. The tension was almost palpable, like the calm before a storm. Jessica was no longer just a random person in the park. She was someone who held the keys to change, someone who could topple the system of oppression and injustice that had allowed men like Foster to act without fear of consequences. Foster's mind raced, trying to process everything. He had been a cop for years, used to a certain sense of invincibility, but now, in the face of Jessica's quiet authority, he felt small, exposed. "You can't do this," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "You don't have the power." Jessica raised an eyebrow, a slight smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. "Don't I?" she asked, her voice laced with quiet confidence. The crowd shifted again, whispers spreading like wildfire. Some were skeptical, unsure of what Jessica had meant, but others were beginning to realize the truth. Jessica wasn't just talking about a random encounter. She was talking about a system that had allowed corruption to flourish unchecked, and she had the power to bring it down. Foster's face reddened with embarrassment. He took a step back, his eyes darting around the crowd, looking for an escape. But he knew it was too late. He had crossed the line, and Jessica was the one who would make sure he paid the price. "You'll regret this," he spat, turning on his heel and walking away. But Jessica didn't react, didn't let his words affect her. She had bigger things to focus on. As Foster disappeared from view, Jessica took a deep breath, feeling a quiet satisfaction. She knew that this was only the beginning. Her actions today were just the first step in a much larger plan. Officer Foster wasn't the real enemy. He was just a symptom of a much deeper problem. And she, Jessica Turner, was ready to fix it. The crowd began to disperse, but Jessica remained standing in the same spot, her mind already racing ahead, thinking about the next move she needed to make. She had a lot of work ahead of her, but with her influence and her knowledge of the system, she was confident that she would make a difference. She had always been a woman of action, and now, more than ever, it was time to take the next step in her mission for justice. As the day continued, Jessica Turner walked away from the park, her mind running through the next steps of her plan. The confrontation with Officer Ryan Foster had been a small victory, but it was only one piece of a much larger puzzle. She knew that this moment, while satisfying, was just the beginning of her efforts to bring justice to a broken system. Jessica's calm demeanor had been her greatest asset in that moment, but beneath the surface, she was already preparing for the real battle ahead. Foster had been the easy part. The harder work would involve dismantling the deeper corruption that allowed people like him to flourish. Jessica had spent years gathering information, learning the ins and outs of the systems that controlled power and justice. Her role in crafting policies and regulations had given her unique access to the levers of change, and now it was time to use that access to bring about real reform. As Jessica walked through the city streets, she passed by buildings that seemed so ordinary to the untrained eye. But she knew the secrets that lay within them. The people who worked inside these buildings held the power to shape the future, and she was determined to ensure that their power was used for good, not for perpetuating injustice. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out to see a message from a colleague. "Are you okay?" it read. Jessica smiled to herself. The people who knew her, who worked alongside her, were aware of the challenges she faced. They also knew that she would never back down, no matter how tough things got. She quickly typed a reply. "Mi fine." It's time to move forward. The message was simple, but it carried all the resolve she needed. Jessica wasn't just going to stop with one victory. She had bigger plans, plans that would change the way the justice system operated. She had always known that the road to reform would be difficult, but now, more than ever, she was ready. She had the knowledge, the connections, and the drive to make it happen. And if she had to face down people like Officer Foster again, she would do it without hesitation. As she entered her office building, Jessica took a moment to reflect on how far she had come. She remembered the days when she had first started in this line of work, full of hope and determination, but also aware of the deep-rooted issues that plagued the system. Now, she was no longer just an observer. She was in a position to make real change. She entered her office, greeted her assistant, and sat down at her desk. The familiar hum of the office environment was comforting, but Jessica's mind was already on the next steps. She had meetings to attend, calls to make, and most importantly, people to hold accountable. As she started to go over her notes, a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called out. The door opened, and her colleague, Agent Mark Davis, stepped inside. "We need to talk," he said. Jessica nodded, motioning for him to sit down. She could tell from his serious expression that something important was coming. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice calm but alert. Mark sat down and leaned forward, lowering his voice. "The investigation into Foster and his colleagues. It's bigger than we thought. There's a whole network of corruption that needs to be exposed." Jessica's heart skipped a beat. She had known the system was broken, but hearing Mark confirm, it only solidified her resolve. This wasn't just about one officer anymore. This was about dismantling an entire network of injustice, and she was the one who would lead the charge. Jessica sat back in her chair, her eyes scanning the documents in front of her. The words blurred together for a moment as the weight of what Mark had just told her sank in. This was no longer just about an individual officer abusing his power. The corruption ran deeper than she had imagined. The network Mark referred to was vast, and its reach extended far beyond the park incident with Officer Foster. Jessica knew this was a pivotal moment. She had spent years positioning herself for something like this, gathering the pieces of the puzzle that, when put together, would reveal the full extent of the rot. But now, the time had come to take action, and that meant making bold moves. She leaned forward and grabbed her phone, tapping out a quick message. She wasn't going to wait. "We need to move faster," she typed. "This is bigger than we thought. Prepare the team for a full-scale operation." Within minutes, her phone buzzed with responses. Her colleagues, Those who had stood by her and supported her vision of reform were ready. It was clear now that they were all in this together. They had a common goal: to tear down the corrupt system that had allowed individuals like Foster to thrive unchecked. Jessica had always known this day would come. The system was broken, and it needed to be fixed. But she also knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. She would be fighting not just against a few rogue officers, but against an entire network of powerful people who had worked together for years, covering up their wrongdoings. Still, Jessica was undeterred. She had been up against obstacles before, and she knew how to handle them. What made this different, though, was that she now had a team behind her, a team that believed in the mission and was ready to fight. "Mark, I need you to start digging into the financials," Jessica said, her voice steady but firm. "We need to know who's funding this network, who's pulling the strings. Start with Foster, but don't stop there. We need a full picture." Mark nodded, already pulling up his laptop and typing out the next steps. "Got it," he replied. "I'll get started right away." Jessica turned her attention back to her computer screen, her mind racing through the next steps. There was so much to do, so much to uncover, but she knew that they were on the right path. She wasn't just going to take down one officer, or even a small group of corrupt individuals. She was going to expose the entire system. And with every move she made, the walls of that system would start to crumble. As the day wore on, Jessica and her team worked tirelessly, connecting the dots and following the trail of corruption. They uncovered shady financial transactions, hidden connections between officers and private contractors, and a network of illegal activity that reached far beyond the local police department. But they also found something unexpected. Among the names and figures they were tracking, Jessica recognized a few familiar faces. These weren't just low-level officers or corrupt officials. These were people she had trusted, people who had worked with her in the past. The realization hit her hard. This wasn't just a fight against the system. This was personal. But Jessica wasn't one to let emotions cloud her judgment. She had a job to do, and she would do it. No matter who she had to take down, no matter how difficult it became, she would expose the truth. The team continued to work late into the night, piecing together the evidence that would bring the entire corrupt network to its knees. As the hours passed, Jessica's resolve grew stronger. She knew that with every piece of information they uncovered, they were getting closer to the heart of the conspiracy. And when the time came, when everything was ready, they would strike with the force of truth and justice. Jessica's mind was clear, her purpose unwavering. This was the moment she had been preparing for her entire career. The system was broken, and she was going to fix it. Jessica sat at her desk, the glow of her computer screen illuminating her face as she scanned through the mountains of data her team had collected. It had been a long night, and the work was far from over, but she felt the weight of the progress they had made. Every document, every piece of evidence they had uncovered brought them closer to the truth. They were no longer just following a trail of corruption. They were starting to piece together the entire puzzle. Officer Ryan Foster had been the first domino to fall, but as Jessica looked at the information on her screen, she realized that his actions were just the tip of the iceberg. The system they were fighting against was far more intricate and deeply embedded than she had imagined. The financial transactions, the backroom deals, the web of influence stretching from the local police department to higher levels of government. It was all there, and it was all connected. Jessica's mind raced as she reviewed the names and faces that kept popping up in the records. Some of them were familiar, people she had worked with, trusted, and even respected in the past. The realization sent a chill down her spine. She had known that the corruption ran deep, but to see the very people she had once collaborated with tied to this network was a hard pill to swallow. It wasn't just about taking down the bad apples anymore. It was about dismantling an entire structure, one that had been built over years, with people at all levels of power profiting from injustice. As she mulled over the information, her phone buzzed again. Another message from Mark. "We've got a lead on the key players behind the financial transactions. I think we found someone big." Jessica's heart skipped a beat. This was it. This could be the breakthrough they needed. She quickly replied, "Where? What do we have?" Mark's response was swift. "A meeting tonight. High-level involvement. It's time to make our move. Jessica's fingers hovered over her keyboard, her thoughts aligning. The pieces were falling into place. Tonight was their opportunity. If they acted now, they could catch the key players in the act and expose the entire operation. It was a risk, but it was a calculated one. She had been preparing for this moment for years. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing on her shoulders, but her resolve remained firm. This wasn't just about justice for herself or her team anymore. This was about the people who had been harmed by this corrupt system. This was about making sure their voices were heard, no matter the cost. She stood up from her desk and walked over to the window, looking out at the city below. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the skyline. It was peaceful, almost serene, but Jessica knew that what was about to unfold would shatter that peace. She wasn't afraid. She was prepared, and when the time came, she would act without hesitation. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from her assistant. "Everything's set for tonight," they said. "We're ready." Jessica nodded to herself, a determined smile crossing her face. "Let's do this," she said, her voice steady and resolute. She grabbed her jacket, made a few quick adjustments to her notes, and walked out of her office. Tonight, the system would be exposed. Tonight, they would show everyone just how deep the corruption really went. As the evening began to settle in, Jessica's heart raced with anticipation. The city, which had been quiet and peaceful just hours ago, now seemed to hum with an underlying tension. The calm before the storm, she thought. She had prepared for this night for so long, and now the time had finally come. The lead that Mark had found was undeniable. Tonight, they would expose the key players in this web of corruption, people who had been pulling the strings from the shadows, hiding behind their power and influence. But Jessica knew this wouldn't be easy. She had to move carefully. One wrong step, one slip up, and the whole operation could fall apart. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. This wasn't just about the high-level officials. This was about sending a message. Tonight, the system would feel the weight of accountability. Jessica and her team were poised for action. She walked through the dimly lit corridors of the building, each step bringing her closer to what they had been working toward. As she neared the meeting point, she passed by her colleagues, all of them ready and focused, each of them knowing that tonight's success would change everything. Mark Davis was already there, reviewing the latest intel on his tablet. He looked up when he saw Jessica approach. "Everything's set," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of the moment. Jessica nodded, her expression serious. "Let's make this count," she replied. They moved into position, ensuring every exit was covered, every contingency planned. The meeting was set to take place at a private location, far from the prying eyes of the public and media. Jessica's team had been monitoring the suspect for weeks, collecting intel, tracking their movements. She had seen the patterns, the connections, and now she was ready to take it all down. The minutes ticked by, and Jessica couldn't shake the feeling of being on the edge of something massive. She could almost feel the eyes of the people who had been wronged, waiting for justice, silently demanding that someone take action. As the time for the meeting drew near, Jessica checked her watch one last time. It was time. They moved into the room. The individuals they had been tracking were already seated, unaware of the storm that was about to hit them. Jessica's heart pounded, but her face remained a picture of calm determination. This was her moment. The people in this room had spent years profiting off of others' pain and suffering, hiding behind their positions of power. Tonight, they would face the consequences of their actions. Jessica made eye contact with Mark, who gave her a slight nod. It was go time. She stepped forward, her voice steady and unwavering as she addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've been operating in the shadows for far too long," she began. The room fell silent, all eyes now on her. "But your secrets are no longer safe. Your actions have consequences, and tonight, you'll learn just how far your corruption reaches." The tension in the room was palpable. The figures in front of her shifted uncomfortably, their eyes narrowing. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Jessica continued, her voice cutting through the silence. "You've been exposed. The evidence is all here, and you'll face justice. It's time to end this." As she spoke, her team moved swiftly, surrounding the room, making sure no one could escape. The tables had turned. The people who had once held the power now found themselves trapped, their futures uncertain. Jessica had planned for every possible outcome, but she knew the hardest part was yet to come. This was just the beginning. Tonight, justice would take its first step forward, and there was no turning back. As Jessica stood at the front of the room, the weight of the moment pressed down on her. The figures seated before her, once so confident in their power, now looked at her with expressions ranging from confusion to fear. She could see the panic starting to set in as they realized their grip on control was slipping. Their empire of corruption, built over years of manipulation and deceit, was unraveling before their eyes, and they were powerless to stop it. Jessica's voice remained calm, cutting through the silence like a knife. You thought you could hide behind your wealth, your positions, your influence, she said, but you're not untouchable. Your time is up. The room was still, the only sound being the subtle shift of uneasy breaths. The individuals who had once been the architects of this corrupt network now found themselves exposed, their darkest secrets laid bare for the world to see. Jessica had done what she set out to do. She had brought them to their knees, but there was still more to be done. The evidence is undeniable, she continued, her gaze unwavering as she surveyed each face in the room. And you will face the consequences of your actions. This is only the beginning. Mark Davis, who had been silently observing from the corner of the room, gave her a brief nod, signaling that everything was proceeding as planned. Jessica felt a surge of satisfaction, but it was tempered by the knowledge that their mission wasn't over. This operation was a pivotal first step in dismantling a corrupt system, but it was just one battle in a much larger war. She wasn't going to stop here. The wheels of justice had been set into motion, but it would take time for the full scope of the operation to unfold. Her team, which had worked tirelessly behind the scenes, was ready to continue the fight. This was only the beginning of a larger movement for change. As Jessica stepped back, allowing her colleagues to begin the next phase of the operation, she felt the weight of the responsibility she had carried for so long finally starting to lift. The corrupt individuals in this room would be held accountable, but there were more who would follow. It wasn't just about taking down a few individuals, it was about changing the system from the ground up. Jessica had known that the fight for justice would be long and difficult, but she had also known that this was her calling. And with every victory, every small step forward, she was one step closer to the world she had always believed was possible. A world where power was held accountable, where those who had been wronged were given the voice and the justice they deserved. As the team continued to work through the night, Jessica knew that this moment would be a turning point. It was the beginning of something much bigger, and there was no turning back now. The morning after the operation, Jessica sat at her desk, staring at the city skyline through the window. The events of the previous night felt surreal, almost like they had been part of a dream. But she knew they were real. The people they had exposed, the corrupt system that had been in place for so long, it was all coming to light. Her phone buzzed, breaking her moment of reflection. She picked it up to see a message from Mark. We're starting the formal investigation. Everything's set in motion. Jessica allowed herself a small smile. The system was now fully aware that it was being watched, and the walls were beginning to close in. It wasn't just about the arrests or the evidence. They had set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. She replied quickly, "Good. Keep me updated." As she set the phone down, she thought about the next steps. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be those who would try to stop them, who would fight to maintain the status quo. But Jessica was resolute. She knew that every action they had taken, every document they had collected, was part of a bigger strategy. She wasn't just fighting for justice in the present moment. She was fighting to change the future. Her colleagues had already begun reaching out to the press, and the public would soon know the truth. It was going to be a turning point in the fight for accountability. Jessica thought back to the faces of the people she had confronted in that meeting. They had been powerful, influential, but in the end, they had been no match for the truth. For so long, they had used their power to manipulate the system, to exploit it for their gain, but now that power was slipping through their fingers. The next few days would be critical. They had to keep pushing forward, never allowing themselves to be distracted or deterred. The stakes were high, but Jessica knew she had the strength and resolve to see this through. She was no longer just a participant in the system. She was changing it. The clock was ticking, and there was no time to waste. With every piece of evidence, every step forward, the system of corruption was crumbling. Jessica wasn't just dismantling a few individuals' careers. She was taking down a system that had been broken for far too long. And with every victory, she knew that more people would start to believe that change was possible. The fight was far from over, but Jessica was more determined than ever. She had seen what was wrong with the system, and now she was fixing it, one step at a time. As the day continued, she gathered her thoughts, preparing herself for the work ahead. She had always known it would take time, but now she could see the change happening, and that made all the difference. The truth was out, and the people who had hidden in the shadows were no longer safe. Justice was coming, and Jessica Turner was going to make sure it prevailed.